Welcome to the Superstar Communicator podcast. My name is Susan Heaton-Wright, a leading impact, speaking and communications expert. My aim is to show you how to make an impact so you will be heard, listened to and respected for career success. Listen weekly to the podcast and go to our website, superstarcommunicator.com. Hello everybody, this is Susan Heaton-Wright from Superstar Communicator. As you know, I am trying to reach out to you all and support you in this extraordinary time. Let's face it, we've never had anything like this before. And I am particularly interested in the chap who's on the other end of the internet now. He's a gentleman called Ben Afia. And he helps companies to create written content for them to find their voice. Now, you're thinking, why on earth am I interviewing Ben? Well, it's because he focuses on written communication, and it's something that we can learn from him, because certainly I was on a workshop with him recently and he was brilliant. So let me tell you a little bit more about him. He's the founder and head honcho of Afia, a UK-based brand language consultancy, and you can explain to me what that means a bit later. Ben's turning the world of corporate speak on its head by helping companies to be more human. Never a bad thing. Over a decade ago, he was one of the first in the world to start managing tone of voice. Now we're going to have to ask him about tone of voice if it's written, aren't we? He was at Boots the Chemists, now part of Walgreen Alliance Boots, that's a mouthful, and helped them improve relationships internally and with customers. He then set up Afia. Over the last decade and a half, he's helped companies like Alliance Insurance win more customers, BP to develop their employer brand, and Google to help marketers understand digital better. Ben's training helped Vodafone boost their customer satisfaction to its highest ever level. He helped E.ON change their culture and save 860,000 letters a year. Now that is a result. And he helped Ron Seal to work out what to say on a tin. Hey, so welcome, Ben. That's fantastic. I love the bit about the Ron Seal. I just wish I was the actor having to say that without having to giggle.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Susan. It's a pleasure to be on. Pleasure to be joining you.
Oh, you know, I know that the listeners are going to love hearing about you. So what made you get into this?
Well, it's interesting. You know, somewhere along the line, you sort of forget what you're good at school, don't you? Sometimes. And English was always my strongest subject, but somehow I forgot. And after a few sales and marketing jobs, I landed at Boots, and I got to build a team of copywriters. So writers for marketing, for annual reports, for products and all that sort of thing. People in agencies and freelance. And my job was to go out and find the best writers in the land and bring them back to work for Boots. And in that job as copy editor and then developing tone of voice, I was back in language, and I suddenly realized that it was something that I had a skill for, I really enjoyed, and it really rekindled my joy of English. And the last 20 years is history now.
Oh, brilliant. And what do you mean by tone of voice? Because certainly for me, it means about the spoken voice, but you're talking about written communication.
Yes, I mostly focus on written. I start in writing, but it does apply to speech as well. So what I'm thinking about, and there are a few terms around this, so you could call it brand language, the language of the brand. Tone of voice is a common term. Some people call it verbal identity. And in organizations or design agencies, advertising agencies, you would have a visual identity. So the verbal identity goes side by side with that. And really, it's about expressing the mission, the values, the behaviors of the brand, the personality of the brand through language. It's how that comes across in language. And the kinds of organizations that I work with tend to be big companies that have large marketing teams. So lots of people writing marketing and working with creative agencies, huge customer service centers. So lots of people talking to customers day in, day out, and they may be on web chat and on emails and all sorts of other ways of communicating. So if you're a big company and you've got thousands of people representing your brand day in, day out with your customers, you need some way of controlling that so that you get a consistent sense of the brand that you want to communicate, the values that you want to come across. You know, how do you want your customers to feel? So tone of voice is really the tool for helping you to manage that. And I use it as a way of changing the culture of an organization so that they can deliver through service what they promise in marketing.
Brilliant. And can you give an example of how you were able to change the culture? Are you able to name names, of course?
I can. So you mentioned in your intro some work with Vodafone. So I've worked with Vodafone on and off for maybe 15 years. And around 7 or 8 years I helped them with their brand strategy. And the particular bit that we looked at was the personality of the brand and then translating that into tone of voice that we've talked about. We then trained hundreds and hundreds of people around the business. We wrote communications. We trained people internally to write, and we ran clinics to help them to write better and transform a lot of their marketing communications and then in customer service. And one chap was in one of our training days, and 3 or 4 years later, he popped up again, and he was managing the contact centers in India. So he got in touch because one of the problems that the Indian teams were having on web chat was that they were getting certain amounts of complaints from British customers. This is just for UK customers, and they have 1,000 people on that team at the time. So they wanted to find a way of helping those Indian teams to have more empathy for British customers so that they would make them happier. And so I use an approach called appreciative inquiry, which is a way of looking at what an organization and what individuals are like when they're really at their best. It's a very positive process, a way of starting from strength. So rather than going in like a classic consultant and trying to diagnose the problem and then prescribe a solution, it turns that on its head. So appreciative inquiry starts from asking groups of people from across the business, what do you like when you're really performing well, when you're really alive, when you're really feeling connected? And there we identify the really great behavior that's going on. And what I found in India was that there was an immense number of very talented, intelligent, motivated people who wanted to do the right thing and look after customers well. So we developed a program with the training team there and a group of champions to capture that best experience, that best behavior, and develop some training that would help the Indians to develop some awareness of how weird us Brits can be, because we are quite odd, aren't we? We don't really like to say what we truly mean. When we complain, we're either ranting or we might say something, yeah, I was a bit disappointed about that. And of course, when a Brit says I'm a bit disappointed, we mean we're absolutely furious. But other nations don't necessarily perceive this because it's not what they've grown up with. So with some cultural training, with some tone of voice training, we helped those teams to really understand British customers better. And the result was that they increased what they use at Vodafone, the Net Promoter Score, which is like a customer satisfaction rating. They increased it by 15 to 20% almost immediately following the training. It was incredibly powerful.
And I would imagine that because it was by phone or by chat, those fantastic Indian workers were not able to pick up on non-verbal communication.
No, it's particularly difficult because written tone of voice is quite hard to read, isn't it? I mean, you know, if you imagine, I don't know, you get into an angry exchange with somebody that you didn't intend, and it happens all the time, doesn't it? Especially on Facebook and Twitter and that sort of. And I think it happens because you're not picking up other cues. So you're not picking up on body language, you're not picking up on spoken tone, and this is where emojis come from actually. So I mean, I use emojis a lot to show when I'm joking or when I'm, you know, because you can't get quite the same body language, the same signal through written communication. So we have to be extra careful there. And so especially if the Brits who hide how we really feel, and we're very, very polite quite a lot of the time, that's very difficult for other nationals. It's very difficult for Brits. I mean, I've worked in customer service centres, and I've seen pieces of communication that, you know, a colleague has sort of shown to me, and I'm struggling. I do this all day, every day, and I'm struggling to really read the emotion behind it. And so it's about equipping people to ask extra questions, to delve beneath and to get extra understanding before they try to solve the problem. It's getting to the true problem, understanding that before you dive in.
Now, you've mentioned about emojis. A lot of people are saying that the use of punctuation is being reduced.
It is.
And I don't know about you, but certainly when I was at school, I was being taught about how different punctuation can actually help in aiding understanding.
Absolutely.
And also I suppose the speed and the pauses within the communication.
Yeah, yeah. It's something I talk about a lot in my writing workshops because, punctuation is crucial. And one of the things that I tend to try and encourage people to do is to reduce the amount of punctuation they use.
Oh, right. Okay.
And what I mean by that is that if you, let's say, for example, if you're prone to long sentences, I try to encourage people to have sort of one concrete idea per sentence.
Right. Okay.
But what people tend to do is that they can ramble on and they can have very long sentences punctuated with commas or colons or semicolons.
Yes.
And those sentences can get longer and longer. But if you think about having one idea per sentence, you then end up with a shorter sentence, finish with a full stop, and you don't need commas and extra punctuation to break up the rhythm. Now, you have to be a little bit careful. You need to not go too short, and too many short sentences can be a bit jumpy. And I did a project a few years ago, actually, for Oxford University Press, and they are marketing to academics. And so that particular audience has a particular way of writing. There is a certain language around academia. My writing tends to be very short sentences, quite upbeat and quite energetic. And I can remember my client, the marketing director, saying to me, "Ben, can you make it a little bit more eloquent?" And so I got one of my freelance team, a chap who used to be who was an ex-Telegraph reporter, to come and join up the sentences and give it a little bit more breathing room, because that was the style that was most appropriate.
Isn't that interesting? Because I think that we've mentioned before that at university, I studied geography, so there were lots of essays, and we were expected to do these long sentences with different clauses, and that was the style that was the norm, certainly in the department I was in.
Yeah, it's very tricky in particular professions, and I'm having this problem with school at the moment. So I was a school governor at my children's junior school, so I got a bit of an understanding about how they're teaching English. And the thing is that the English that I teach, which is for business and for clear communication, is not necessarily the English that my children are being taught in school. They're actually being taught to put more colour into their language. But in business, we're trying to take that out because it can start to confuse things. I find it really interesting that they're actually learning more about the nuts and bolts of grammar than I ever learnt at school, because if you grew up in the 70s and 80s in Britain, grammar wasn't taught, was it? So I have then worked with people who have done English degrees, and they're streets ahead of me on understanding the grammatical terminology. But in some ways, I think that's been an advantage to my advantage, because it means that it's forced me to come up with very clear explanations. And so if I'm in a room of people, most of whom are unlikely to have English degrees, most people don't understand the grammatical language, the jargon. And so one of the things that I'm trying to promote all the time is to reduce the technical and the jargon language, the sort of language that is a part of a particular profession. And every organisation has it. So universities have the language of academia.
Yes.
And different disciplines within academia have different language.
Yes, they do.
Economics in particular, for example.
Sorry, what was that?
Economics in particular.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Or legal language, for example. Yes. Different professions, of course, have it. So you will have within organisations, you will tend to have an organisational culture, and that's driven by, I suppose, the organisational, the heart of the organisation.
Mm-hmm.
So for an energy company, it might be the language of the engineer. In a financial services company, it might be the actuary or the risk specialist. So you get this kind of specialist language creeping through, but of course it's not relevant to customers.
No, and you've hit a really interesting point, because certainly with spoken communication, I talk about trying to avoid jargon and trying to be brief and concise as possible in spoken communication, particularly when we are in a virtual setting, because people's minds wander. And in order to make that impact, we've got to be very, very clear and concise.
Absolutely.
Are you having to do that more and more as you have developed in your profession? Have you seen the
Definitely. I think, I mean, tone of voice as an idea really emerged nearly 20 years ago, perhaps in sort of UK, in British businesses and creative agencies. And it was very new when I started doing it, but now it's been talked about much, much more. And I think that most marketing people within organizations and customer experience people will be at least aware of tone of voice and may well have had a go at developing guidelines and trying to change how their organization communicates. But there's still a huge amount of work to do. And I think the reason for that is that when we are trying to help people to write and to speak in a different way, we're talking about their professional persona, their professional personality. So it's a bit like putting your suit on to go to work, although we're not doing that at the moment, of course. Yes. But if you're used to putting a suit on to go to work, it's almost like your professional persona. It's part of your character. And the language that you use is a part of that as well. So what's really interesting, I often find that very senior people can be very confident and very quick to change their language. But sometimes they can have a lot of the jargon in spite of the fact that it might not be clear. So it can be sometimes that you are using the language and you feel that it's part of what made you successful. And in fact, it can be in spite of.
I think that's a really interesting observation. I mean, certainly I found, and people back me up on this, that sometimes perhaps lawyers use specific compliance terms or terminology almost to outdo the opposition.
Absolutely. One of the examples I always think about, if you see an economics professor from LSE, say, interviewed on Newsnight, are they there because they've got big words? Almost certainly not. They're almost certainly there because, yes, they're an economics professor, they're highly qualified and expert in their field, but they know their field so well that they're able to translate it and to make it simple for people, for a Newsnight audience. So when people are being, good people who are interviewed and are good at speaking on TV or in interviews on podcasts or radio, they're usually there because they're good at explaining, and that comes from their skill and depth of experience. And I find that people really struggle to get their heads around this concept, the idea that as you become more expert, you can speak more plainly. But I do think that true expertise speaks clearly, and that comes from confidence.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, listeners, you will have heard a really, really good podcast interview with Jeff Heisman, who talks about making the language simpler within the insurance and legal industries, where there's a lot of compliance. And he suggests if you have to say that particular sentence, that then you back it up with a case study. Is that something that you would recommend as well?
It is, absolutely. So this is about being more concrete with your language. So yes. The idea is to explain rather than to use language. And just so one example that I came across many years ago. So I was working with Legal & General, the pensions and insurance company. And they had two definitions for the word maturity. So when a pension policy matures, it has a particular meaning. When a life insurance policy matures, it has a slightly different meaning. And we were looking at this document. We were looking at policy documents, actually. I can get quite geeky about stuff like that, bizarrely. Like all kinds of communications, terms and conditions I quite like as well.
Ooh.
All of these are opportunities to speak more clearly and to engage customers and make them feel happier about the product they're buying and more comfortable and that they trust you better. So we were looking at this word maturity, and when we realized that it had two definitions within the company, we thought, well, how on earth is a customer going to understand if we have two ways of defining it? So sometimes you have to say more, and for the word maturity, actually, it's better to explain what it means.
Yes.
And there you might have a sentence or even a paragraph. I was working with a colleague. There's a friend of mine who I've worked with for many, many years. My first ever kind of keynote speech, if you like, which was maybe about 12 years ago, I was speaking to Air BP, the aviation fuel division of BP, and their the leadership conference in Barcelona. The guy who was organising that conference I became friendly with, and we've worked together ever since. And we were talking about a new product area just the other day, and in this area, it's very it's a slippery slope towards using some of the jargon that you think your customers or your clients are going to expect. And I find that all people have trouble getting away from the language that conveys gravitas, because we all want to sound like an expert.
Yes.
And this is the nub of the problem. So every profession, every kind of organization struggles with, how do we convey our expertise? How do we give a sense of gravitas without dumbing down, and yet be simple and connect with that audience without it sounding dumbed down? And that's an art.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Certainly recently I had a testimonial on LinkedIn, and the lady it speaks English as a second language, and she said, Susan is very simple. And at first, okay, great, thanks for that. She backed it up by saying, no, you explain it so it's very straightforward. Yeah. And I can go away, I just get it straight away. Mm-hmm. So I was really pleased she qualified. Absolutely.
I think it takes true expertise and confidence to be able to speak and write simply, and it takes a lot. It can take a lot of work. So,
do you think that language has evolved, say from when I mean, you're a little bit younger than me, but
not that much younger, I don't think.
I don't know. Do you think it has evolved since we were at school and we were at university?
It absolutely has, and it is evolving, and it's continuing to evolve. And actually, that pace of evolution is accelerating. So, the research that kicked off the work that I did for Legal & General, which was about 15, 16 years ago, they had done a piece of research called discourse analysis, which is looking at the sort of sum of all the conversations going on within the organisation and outside the organisation. So with stakeholders, with the city, with customers, and all the departments internally and with partners. So that picture was telling Legal & General at the time that one of the things that it was picking up on was that language is evolving. The internet has made language less formal. Yeah. Forms of writing like email and text have actually brought spoken forms into written language. Yeah. And so that is changing the general public, certainly in the UK, America, Australia. It's changing our perceptions of what we expect to see from organisations. And so that is changing what people expect to see. And what Legal & General found from this research was that some of their language, which was quite sort of kind of typical of the financial services industry at the time, was actually putting a bit of a barrier up between them and their customers. And that's when they decided to do something about it, because they didn't want that barrier to be there. They wanted to feel like they were in tune with their customers and responding to their needs. And because, pensions and life insurance are really about trust, aren't they? They're about a promise for the future. And you need to know that you can trust the organisation you're buying from. And so that's when they set about doing something about it. And the Tone of Voice project, the work that I did for quite a number of years with them, came out of that.
That's interesting. Now, I'm now in my 50s, and I, for some reason, Googled the ads that I get are all about seniors, seniors and insurance. And they have quite often there's somebody with a Zimmer frame, and I said,
there's a reason for this. I'm gonna.
Oh, sorry, please do. It pisses me off.
Well, I've just got to tell you. So, and the marketers in your audience will not like me for this, but the problem with marketing is that it's done by young people. Yeah. Most marketers. So I am 49 now, and I am quite often the oldest person in the room.
You're going to get these emails soon.
I'm going to be starting to get them soon, because for the marketing community, which is in their 20s, 30s, maybe getting into 40s, but 40s is old for kind of creative agencies and marketers. So they, I think when you're young, over 50 is old, isn't it? Of course, we know that it's only the second beginning. I'm looking forward to it.
My grannies both died at 97. I've got a long way to go yet.
Impressive, yeah. Mine was similar, 98 and 100.5. So I'm thinking I'm going to do 105. That's my target.
You've got a long way to go. You're not senior yet.
Absolutely not. And actually, that's the interesting thing about how language is evolving. So I'm fascinated by how social media is influencing language. When I look at my kids who are 14 and 16 now, my teenagers, how they're using language. And one of the things that came up in the press just recently was a report that apparently teenagers, for the teenagers and millennials, if you use full stops in WhatsApp, it's seen as aggressive. And I thought, well, this is unusual. Why are full stops seen as aggressive? And apparently what happens is when you're in messaging apps like Apple Messages or iPhone Message or WhatsApp or text, you put a single idea in a sentence and you send the text. And you put a single idea and you send the text. So you have these chains of text. And of course, they are standalone sentences effectively. So you don't need a full stop. So when I looked back at how I use WhatsApp and messaging, I don't put full stops in. I hadn't really occurred. And so what some younger people are now seeing is that when you put a full stop, it feels aggressive. It feels abrupt. So isn't that interesting how a full stop, which was something that we just take for granted as the end of a sentence, actually for different age groups can feel different.
And it's a different platform.
Absolutely.
And
these things are platform dependent. Yeah. So I would never not use, full stops on my website or in customer letters. Absolutely not. And you do have to be aware of the grammar that people learn. So when I was at Boots, where I really immerse myself in language, as we said in the introduction, we were doing some work for Boots Opticians, and Boots Opticians at the time, their market, so this is quite a while ago, but the main market for Boots Opticians is 50 plus. And at that time, we figured that that audience would have probably learnt grammar properly at school, like what I didn't. So,
well, I thought you did.
And so because those people may have more traditional ideas about how to use grammar, we thought that we shouldn't do things like use very short sentences for impact or use contractions like I'll and we'll and you'll. And those are things those are sort of conversational style that I would tend to use, but not with a particular audience if they would feel that it's incorrect. And there are people that get very het up about grammar, so we don't want to annoy those people, do we?
Yeah, the grammar police.
Yeah. But for the rest of the Boots audience, which was perhaps a younger market, especially, beauty or, the other ranges where they wanted to be attracting younger people, then a more casual, more conversational style of language would be absolutely appropriate. So it's about thinking about your audience.
Which is what these 20-year-old, 25-year-old marketeers aren't doing with my Zemiframe.
No. And that's unfortunate because really they should know better, because the segmentation and targeting on things like Facebook is so precise now. You really can pick out your audience. So they're wasting their advertising spend there, aren't they? You don't need to be seeing that sort of thing. Yeah, there's a problem there.
A 53-year-old and a 75-year-old with respect, isn't there?
Absolutely. Well, and even my dad, who's 77 and fit as a fiddle, he's playing 3 or 4 rounds of golf. Since he retired, he's become a championship golfer. And he does not need a Zimmer frame.
Now, I know when I listened to your or saw your fantastic presentation for PSA, you talked about active and passive voice. Now, is there any way you could explain that in a straightforward way so that people like me can understand that a bit better?
Yeah, and I think it relates to the story about Vodafone, I think, because one thing that us Brits do, we use the active and the passive. We use the passive in a particular way to be passive-aggressive, actually. So if I give you a sentence, a letter will be sent. A letter will be sent. You don't know who's going to send that letter. Whereas if I say to you, I'll write to you, you know that I'm writing to you. And it does 3 things. It makes the relationship between the person writing and the person reading clearer. It has more energy, and it has much more of a sense of ownership. So if I use the active voice, I'll write to you, it has all sorts of benefits. But what we tend to do, especially in Britain, is we use the passive to avoid responsibility. And it's rife throughout organizations. And if I'm working with an organization, and if I could do one thing for most people, it would be to help them to use the active rather than the passive voice. Because what we'll tend to do is we'll use it to hide and to shirk responsibility, or to not point the finger, to say that was a bit disappointing, rather than I'm really disappointed in you.
Right. Okay.
So it's a really crucial technique, and it's one that I think all people need to learn. And the key to it is that because it forces you to say that I'm doing something for you. So the person is at the beginning of the sentence. The actor comes before the verb. It forces you to know exactly what you are doing. Now, in some organisations that have that maybe have older processes, sometimes you don't know who's going to do something. And so they'll use the passive because they don't know specifically who it's going to do. But what that encourages me to say to them is to say, well, could you change the process so that you can say who's going to get back in touch? So I have had to send a microphone back to Curry's just recently. And for various reasons, I didn't get the new one sent out. And so I spoke to one of the managers, and what she did was she said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to speak to so-and-so, I'm going to speak to so-and-so. I'm going to find out this information, and then I'm going to give you a call back and let you know exactly what I've done. I'm going to do that by the end of the day, and I'm going to follow up on Saturday and Sunday when I go off shift, and then I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, and his name is Adrian.
Brilliant.
And he's going to follow it through the rest of the week. So what she was doing was using active language to say specifically what she was doing. And she went and did it, and she made the call, and she came back to me, and she told me specifically what she'd done and what the next action was going to be. And I don't have my microphone back, which is frustrating, but I do feel confident that it's going to happen because she's taken ownership. So What the active voice that has done there is to give me evidence that she's taking ownership, because we don't like gaps. When we're creating a picture of a story in our minds of information, of incomplete information, we fill the gaps and we try to make assumptions about what's happening because we have this need as human beings to complete the story. So if we don't want people to fill in the gaps for themselves and we want them to trust what we're saying, we need to use the active voice, be specific, and give detail.
Oh, brilliant. Now, before we finish, I always ask my guests for 3 top tips. Now, for you, it will be 3 top tips about written communication. If you'd like to share those with the audience.
Sure. I suppose I would go back to the process that I talked about at the PSA session that you came to several weeks ago, which I call Afia tone. So A is for audience, and so that would be my first tip. The first tip in any communication is to really think deeply about your audience and what's going on for them at the time they're receiving your communication, because we all have limited attention, don't we? We are busier than we've ever been. We all feel constantly inundated with different messages on social media, from companies, from our friends, our families. We're dealing with so much that we have filters. The brain has a filter and it's rejecting things that it doesn't see as immediately relevant. So as a communicator, it's your responsibility to think what's going on for your audience, the person that you're writing to, the person that you're speaking to, so that you can make sure that your message connects. The second of those steps is focus. So it's then to be very clear about what you want your audience to think or to feel or to do as a result of the thing that you're communicating to them. Quite often people will communicate all of the things that are in their head, and they'll write far too much or they'll say far too much. Much better to understand what state of mind your audience is going to be in, and then try and deliver one message that is most likely to connect with them. So that's the second tip. And the third step in that process is to think about what will inspire. So AFIA, audience, focus, and inspire. What is in your audience's interest? What's most going to hook them in? What's in their interest and going to excite them about your message? So it's not thinking from your own perspective, it's thinking from their perspective. So if you think about your audience, think about what you want your focus is, what you want them to think, feel, and do, and then what's going to inspire them, you've got much more chance of your message hitting home.
Oh, that's absolutely brilliant. And listeners, remember that I create a script of this afterwards if you want to read through this again. So before you go, Ben, how can people get in contact with you? Is there a course that you can offer? Is it an ebook? Do let me know. There
is. So the best place is probably my website, which is benafia.com, so benafia.com. And on there, you'll find right at the top a link to get my ebook, which is called Cut the Crap, How to Write So People Trust You. And in the ebook, it's a fairly quick read, 15 minutes or so, and it gives you the 5 steps in the Afia tone process. So it'll talk you through how to understand your audience, to think about your focus, how to inspire, and it'll get down eventually to some tone of voice techniques where we start to talk about things like shorter sentences and using the active rather than the passive voice. So that gives a good summary of really what is the foundation of the training that I've been delivering to the companies I've worked with for the last 15 or 16 years.
Oh, fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the podcast, message to the audience?
I think if I could do one thing, it would be to inspire people to think more carefully about their communications and think about their audience and how it's going to connect with them, because we're so wrapped up in our own minds, aren't we? And this is normal human tendency. But if we think about what's going on for other people, we're much more likely to connect with them, to show empathy, to feel empathy. And that means that our communication is much richer and much more fruitful. Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. This has been an absolutely fantastic interview. And the sound was great, wasn't it? It was. After all that. Absolutely. And so I'd like to thank you so much. Remember, you can get in contact with Ben yourselves. Grab that ebook, because I know from reading it myself, it's full of content. And get in contact with Ben if you need some help for your company. So thank you very much, Ben. You're welcome. It's been a lot of fun. So until next time, this is Susan Heaton-Wright from Superstar Communicator. Thanks for listening. You have been listening to the Superstar Communicator podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and review the podcast on iTunes and on apps. Please contact us if you want to discuss any topic, could suggest a topic for us to include, or a guest who could come onto the podcast. Go to superstarcommunicator.com.